Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Sam Claflin, Paul Bettany and Asa Butterfield are in the trenches of World War I in Journey's End. Set in France in 1918 and the war is as a stalemate, but fighting is expected to resume soon. It's C Company's monthly rotation to spend 6 days in the trenches on the front line, including Toby Jones's Mason, Stephen Grantham's Trotter, Tom Sturridge's Hibbert, Paul Bettany's Lieutenant Osborne, and led by Sam Claflin's Captain Stanhope. They're joined by a young second lieutenant named Raleigh, played by Asa Butterfield, who was asked to be assigned to Stanhope's company, having known him from school, but he soon discovers Stanhope is a changed man who has become an alcoholic from the traumas of war. When news arrives that the Germans are preparing an offensive in days, the company must await their fates. The play, Journey's End, was written in 1928 by R.C. Sherriff, and its initial production featured a very young Laurence Olivier in the role of Stanhope. It didn't take it very long to be adapted for the screen. 1930, in fact, marked its first film adaptation, and then again shortly thereafter in a German production, and again in the 70s in the form of Aces High, which transplanted the setting to the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps. And there have been other adaptations of Journey's End, but they've largely been TV movies, notably a BBC television production in the 80s, but for the longest time, no one could quite figure out who actually had the film rights to Journey's End, and there was a very lengthy, invested process to determine who actually owned the rights to adapt the play to the screen, to the point where Prince Andrew himself actually got involved in trying to rectify the situation, because there were interested parties in trying to launch a new film adaptation to coincide with the centenary of both the Spring Offensive that the play depicts, but also the end of the First World War. Eventually, it was determined that they might be with Warner Brothers, but it turned out that their rights had actually lapsed in 2008, allowing this production to commence. And when it was initially announced, the producers were very much set on trying to hire the cream of A-list British acting talent. They were thinking of the likes of Benedict Cumberbatch, Eddie Redmayne, and Tom Hiddleston. Not to slight the cast that they did end up getting, but it does seem like on its way to the screen, their ambitions for Journey's End have rather diminished, and that's kind of reflected in the release of the film, because for a major anniversary movie, the release has been fairly muted, and it's not had this very wide release, it has to be said, and you could be very easily forgiven for overlooking it. This isn't a war movie in the traditional sense. This isn't a movie about combat. It's a story of waiting, which I think is all too appropriate, because that's one of the titles that Sherriff was considering for his play before stumbling on the quotation that gives this play its title. And so this bears more in common with something like Sam Mendes' Jarhead, and I'm not talking about the direct-to-video sequels, in that it's very much about the realities of being on the front line when you're not fighting. And that's the situation that the characters are in at the beginning of this movie, in that the fighting has stopped, but everyone knows that at some point it will resume again, and it's only a question of when and who is going to be in the trenches at that time and unlucky enough to be there. That is what the film deals with. It's dealing with those fears and anxieties, not knowing whether the fighting will happen again, not knowing if you'll be able to survive, not knowing if you'll be able to come back to your country, not knowing whether you'll be able to come back to the people that you love. And what the play does really well, as something that was written very close to the time, and as something that has been adapted now, is that it very much gives you a very strong emotional connection to these events, which I think we need right now, because obviously 100 years has passed, and these events could feel somewhat distant, but the film does a very vivid job of imagining this war for you on screen, and I often found myself, when I was watching this movie, thinking about what if I was in this situation? What if I was born in this time? I'd be very likely one of these people fighting in the trenches. How would I react? How would I deal with the situation? It's really quite a sobering thought. You can clearly tell they spent a lot of time recreating the conditions of trench life, as they should, because so much of the movie is spent there and in the officers' dugout, and as a result, it's incredibly immersive. You feel like you're right there alongside them. It's dark and claustrophobic and cramped, and there's sparse resources. It's grimy, it's dirty, there are rats crawling on the floors. It's really quite bracing, and all the while there is this sense of dread hanging over it. There is this literal stench of death. When Riley arrives early on in this movie, he's told that they inherited the trench from the French and that they had reinforced it with the bodies of fallen soldiers. It's very, very atmospheric, so props to the production designers, and it's a real testament, I think, to the strength of the film that it really is so effective at using this setup, this scenario, because it doesn't have a huge amount of resources at its disposal and it's relatively limited in its locations, but it leaves a very huge impression because of it. As you can probably tell, this is very much an actor's piece, given its theatrical origins and the fact that it's very dialogue heavy. And as such, it gives a lot of really great character actors room to bring these roles to life, no matter how small, because they're distinguished by who's playing them. For example, Toby Jones plays the cook Mason, who brings some welcome humour to the proceedings as he's trying to scurge up some kind of edible meals for the soldiers and officers, using very limited resources that have often been totally mislabelled. And alongside that character, you've also got Trotter, and he's played by Stephen Grantham, who is a terrific British character actor. He may not be as well known internationally as Toby Jones. To local audiences, he will be a very familiar face. He appears in a lot of projects, and he tries to keep a relatively positive spirit in amongst all these soldiers that are often broken and traumatised. And these two characters, they bring a certain amount of welcome levity to the proceedings. You need that in this movie, and they are a certain amount of warmth to the movie, but even then, those characters are still utterly afraid of the situation, and there are moments where you see that etched in them. You've also got Tom Sturridge, who plays a officer who is complaining that he has neuralgia, but Stanhope is convinced that it might be cowardice, that he's trying to get out of fighting by claiming that he's in such pain, and Stanhope has increasingly diminished patience for that. It's a character that is the most explicitly fearful, and it's very much ambiguous over whether he is actually suffering or whether he is trying to get out of this awful situation. Paul Bettany is really terrific in this role as Lieutenant Osborne, who is known by the other soldiers as Uncle. He's the oldest among them. He very much approaches the scenario with a certain amount of worldly wisdom. When the characters need some kind of advice or someone to talk to, they go to him. He gives that character a real kind of weight and significance to him. He very much feels like he is the glue that is holding everything together, especially Stanhope. But the real revelation for me is Sam Claflin. I think that Claflin is utterly brilliant in the role of Stanhope. He is so consumed with his emotions, and he is someone who is suffering from what is clearly PTSD, but obviously wouldn't be recognised at the time this play is set or written. But that's very much how Claflin approaches the character, but it's also tinged with this very intense self-loathing, and this came as something of a shock to the system for me, because I've seen Claflin in mostly lighter fare. He really has these scenes where he gets to dominate over the proceedings, and he is genuinely quite terrifying. He's a character that's fallen into alcoholism, he's totally dependent on the bottle to even function, and he's just totally broken and is completely aware of that, and the only thing that he has more disdain for than himself is for the people in charge of the operations, his commanding officers. If there is a weak link in this cast, it has to be said, it's Asa Butterfield, who I think very much overplays the wide-eyed naivete of Raleigh. And I know that's meant to be the point of the character, that he's meant to stand in very sharp relief to the other soldiers in the company who have done their time and have experienced the horrors of war firsthand and know exactly what it's like, compared to this fresh-faced, freshly drafted boy who still thinks there's some kind of nobility about what's going on, that he's going to come onto the front lines and be reunited with his friend and is going to become a man. And that's not what modern warfare is like. And over the course of the film, he comes to realise that Stanhope is not as he remembered him, that Stanhope is completely shot, as he puts it. And there is this tension between these two characters in that when Raleigh arrives and Stanhope sees him, he's horrified, because he sees in Raleigh not only someone who is so young, and I think it bears reiterating how many men fought in this war and how young they really were, but also this genuine coursing anger that he's here, how could he be here? And he's this horrible reminder of this person that he used to be, this person before the war. He's in love with Raleigh's sister, and it's just eating him up inside, and he's just totally distraught about seeing his old school friend. And it's in those moments, I think Claflin really sells that character, whereas Butterfield plays him with such over-eager enthusiasm that it starts to feel exaggerated, even as an innocent discovering dark reality across the events of the film. By and large, the film is very faithful to the structure of the play, but at the same time, they have tried to open it up. They've tried to make it more cinematic, which makes sense because the play only has one location. It's all entirely set in the officers' dugouts. What they try to do is expand the scope, add a few more locations, and there is room in the play to do this. There are events that occur in it that happen entirely off stage, so you can fill in the blanks, as it were. So there's an early scene where Raleigh is visiting his uncle to be drafted into C Company, and that's a brand new scene. The most significant addition is that 2/3 of the way through the story there's a raid, and in the play this occurs entirely off stage, but in the film they visualised it as an action sequence, and you'd think to yourself, okay, well surely that would be good for the movie in having that sort of big moment in there. Actually, it works against the movie, because it becomes abundantly obvious that they were working with the tiniest of budgets here, and so the way that this sequence is realised is that they've tried to make it impressionistic. What they have done is that they have used shaky cam, and I presume it's meant to be atmospheric, it's meant to place you alongside them, it makes you feel like you're one of them, and at the same time, all the shakiness, it hides the fact that they had a lot of budgetary constraints here. But it just doesn't work. It's very obvious what they were doing there, and at the same time it results in a whole lot of confusion. It actually becomes very unclear what is going on screen, more so than the filmmakers were obviously intending, because there is a major character fatality, and the film, I think, for my money, performs a major misstep in this moment, because in the play, obviously, that character just simply disappeared in the gap in time. And the film tries to recreate that effect, as it were, and it just doesn't work. It backfires on the movie immensely because it's not immediately obvious to the audience what actually happened. I had guessed that had occurred, but because it's so confoundingly depicted, I think it will take a lot of people a moment to actually process what has occurred, because we simply don't see it. It keeps, I think, a certain amount of theatricality. It never shakes it. It always feels like you're being kept at a distance, in spite of all the attempts to immerse you into the reality of these characters. It always feels like you're one step away from it. Anyone who has watched a play translated onto film knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's not a huge shortcoming of the film, but the movie just never overcomes that hurdle. But the thing that really, I think, is affected by it is that there is meant to be a tension about this story. The fact that the clock is ticking away to the inevitable offensive. And the characters know this, we know this, and yet it feels like we're simply just waiting for it to occur, as opposed to this hugely unbearable event looming over these characters. We should be feeling that. The other title that R.C. Sherriff was thinking about this play was Suspense, and I think this film version is really lacking that aspect of the story, and I think to some extent the decision to open it up, to make it feel less constricted to this one environment, actually works against it. However, in spite of its problems as an adaptation, I think they'll be moot by the time the ending rolls around. If there's one thing this had to get right, and it does, it's the ending, which is very powerfully portrayed on screen. I think it very much gets across the message of the story that it's adapting for the screen, and I think that the movie accomplishes what it sets out to do in spite of its problems narratively and on a filmmaking level, because it very much recreates the realities and hardships of the First World War for a generation that is so distant from it now. And I think we need that reminder. We need to remember those sacrifices and those struggles of those men, those men that were taken far too young. And I think that even in this solid but flawed version of it, Journey's End still has a lot of impact. Journey's End is a sombre reminder of the horrors of World War I and the sacrifices many men made that must not be forgotten. The film is less about direct conflict than it is the crushing realities of the war, as it authentically portrays the hardships of living in the trenches and their squalid conditions. Very much a character piece, the film is well-intentioned and well-acted, but never shakes the stagey feel of its theatrical origins, despite mixed attempts to open up the story, losing some of the unbearable tension it should have. Nevertheless, the power of the ending remains undiminished, and Journey's End is an affecting work. If you like this review, then you can pledge to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.